Good afternoon, everyone. So, okay, so I was asked to give a talk, and those who I think I can see that most of those who came to my class this fall are not here. So, but most of the fall we've been talking about philosophy and Madhyamaka and the methods, and I thought I'll choose a different topic and present some other work I'm involved in now that I'm working on, especially on the question of secular Buddhism. And the question of the view. So the title is The View Obsolete, because I'm going to talk especially about this notion that Buddhism, as explained by some of the teachers of secular Buddhism now, or Buddhist modernism, the idea that Buddhism is just a set of techniques and practices to feel better or to have a better life, and that the teachings of Buddhism on reality, what we generally call the view, are, first of all, not very important, not very useful, and maybe even not required anymore, or something of the past that is not really relevant in the current world. And so that's some project I'm working on since a few years, because I know at least I was starting to work on that issue when I was still at RYI 3 or 4 years ago. Because, for example, I remember that I got feedback on those papers by Shireen and by Julia, who are both here, so thank you. And so I guess it's because it's a kind of a slow going project. But Olaf, maybe you can switch the slide. Just as in terms of introduction, I'm not sure how familiar people are here with those notions of secular Buddhism or Buddhist modernism. And especially these days in the literature, or some authors present those concepts in opposition to traditional Buddhism. I think those of you who are students at RYI and take the course History of Buddhism in Asia, you have usually some training on those issues. And the notion of secular Buddhism or Buddhist modernism, sometimes also called Protestant Buddhism, is usually considered to have appeared in the 19th century in places like Sri Lanka and Thailand, in large part in reaction to the activities of missionaries, British or Dutch, mostly British, I think, in those areas, and is kind of generally understood as a kind of Buddhism adapted for the modern world, especially adapted to be consistent with science and modern versions of sort of rationality, and the emphasis on rationality, science, positivism, as opposed to more traditional forms of Buddhism, which are considered to be a little bit more anchored in myth, metaphysics, and all kinds of things that have developed over the centuries in all the Buddhist traditions of the world. Okay, so my starting point here is with some of the reactions I've encountered while here in Nepal to this notion of secular Buddhism. And I put a couple of quotes here. One is from Dzongzar Chense Rinpoche when he was teaching here at the hotel, I think a few years ago in Salti, or some hotel like that. And he said, yeah, those British Buddhists who cherry pick among Buddhist doctrine should be cut, sliced, skewered, and barbecued. And I mean it. And I think here the general meaning is that people think that Buddhism will be destroyed by communism or cultural revolution or something like that. But he was saying, no, the real danger is from those Western authors who want to reduce Buddhism to something that doesn't have a view. And so losing the essential part of what the Dharma teachings have to offer. The second quote I chose to bring is something that Pakcho Rinpoche told me here once after he gave a lecture on, I think, the notion of scholar practitioner here in the room upstairs. Or maybe it was another occasion, I don't remember. But anyway, I think I was telling him I was teaching a class here at RYI on Buddhism and modernity. He said, what is that about? I said, oh, this is about how people adapt Dharma teachings, to the modern world, to keep them relevant and interesting for the people. And he said, no, Buddhism doesn't have to adapt to modernity. Modernity should adapt to Buddhism. So I thought, okay, that's a very ambitious wish, but so I wasn't quite sure what to make with that. But it turned out, I think, it fueled my reflection. Some of the other sources that were interesting for me in thinking about this topic is a book by Evan Thompson. Maybe some of you are familiar with that author. He was very involved in the kind of mind and life and the dialogue between Buddhism and science kind of discourse. And in his book, which is called Why I'm Not a Buddhist, or Why I'm Not Buddhist, I think I've made a mistake there. He makes a clear distinction between Buddhist modernism which he criticizes heavily the notion of Buddhist modernism, especially using the concept of Buddhist exceptionalism, saying that when scientists who study, for example, the effects of meditation study Buddhism, suddenly they lose a great deal of their critical thinking, because Buddhism has such kind of a positive connotation and aura that suddenly they become sort of less critical and not really able to do good research. And he puts that in contrast with traditionalism or traditional Buddhism. And the main topic of his book is that you have to choose either to be a Buddhist modernist, that means buy into all those sort of stereotypes about Buddhism that people have in that field, or be what he calls a traditional Buddhist. That means believe in all the views developed in Buddhist traditions in various cultures, such as, that Mount Meru is the center of the world and there are 4 continents and karma and rebirth, and you have to take all of that literally. And he says, I'm not able to belong to any of these schools, so therefore I'm not a Buddhist. Okay, so he gives us a choice. And so I thought that was interesting, and this is some of the things I will be answering or discussing today. One of the concerns I had was, okay, it's okay to say we'll skewer and barbecue the Buddhists, but is there more, maybe, would it be useful to engage also with those views in a little bit more constructive way, other than denouncing them? And especially, is there still something we can learn from those criticisms? Is there something for us to learn for ourselves regarding our own position about these questions? I also have to say, around those years, I was teaching here at RYI, and we had a class. And whenever those things came up, there were a few students who also came very strongly against this idea, especially of concept of mindfulness, and the idea that Buddhism is a set of therapeutic methods to feel better about your life, and that all those other teachings, those lineage teachings, like all the Vajrayana, the visualization, everything based on imagination, all the views, all the philosophy is useless. And people reacted quite strongly against that. And so I was even stronger than I expected. So I wasn't quite ready to answer all those questions. So I thought, I should do it. So I took on that responsibility. And maybe Olaf, we can switch to the next slide. And I went to the sometimes tedious work of reading books like After Buddhism by Stephen Batchelor. I don't want to say that Stephen Batchelor reading his book is tedious. Actually, I think Stephen Batchelor is a very good writer. And he reads really nicely. And he has a lot of quotes and interaction with the sutras, especially the Pali canon. So I kind of enjoyed reading that. Not that I agree with this view, but I don't want to say it's too bad. But if we look at the next one, why Buddhism is true. Yeah, that I confess I do find a bit tedious to read. This is more the sort of scientific take on Buddhism and meditation practice. And just the title of this book somehow irritates me. So I have to make a little bit of an effort to go there. I think that the idea that Buddhism is true for me just doesn't make any sense, in a sense. Like, what does it mean to say Buddhism is true? But anyway, I took on that job. And so part of this work is a book chapter I already published in a volume by Shambhala that came out, I think 2021 or 22, called Secularizing Buddhism. And now after that, they asked me to do a little bit more. So now I'm working on a bigger project that includes more aspects. So this is today I'm sharing with you part of these projects, or some aspects of these projects I'm working on. Okay, so basically an answer to that. So the basic question is, okay, if we disagree with what these people are saying, then what is my answer? Yeah, okay, if the view is still relevant, then how so? And why is it still important? And also, if it is true, I think especially in the community at RYI, maybe it's a little bit different from what you would find in other places, like in the West, for example. Most people kind of already made the decision to come and study the Indian classics, the Buddhist philosophy, and so forth. So they're already kind of convinced that studying the view is important. But in other places, this could be considered almost like mainstream or regular approach to what Buddhism is about. And I'm especially concerned, I would say I'm just sharing a little bit of background about why I'm interested in this. I'm concerned about people who, for example, in Sanghas in North America, for example, in my Buddhist community in North America, who read a lot of Dharma books, but when they turn to English books that are not written by Buddhist teachers, all they find is this kind of literature that gives a view of Buddhism that is highly secularized and highly reduced to whatever we can say from the point of view of science or sort of modern philosophy, without engaging seriously with the teachings of Buddhist philosophy. So I think there's some sort of a lack. I've been waiting, and it seems like nobody wants to answer right back. Nobody wants to take it up. So I think it fortunately falls on me to do it. So okay, maybe we can switch. Yeah, next one. Skip. Oh, I'm waiting for you to do it. I'm looking at my. I have to skip. Okay, so just for those of you who are not familiar with these authors, what is secular Buddhism? Okay, I didn't do a kind of a full survey or exhaustive study of this phenomenon. You could have, for example, things like secular spiritual traditions that are inspired by Buddhism, such as Shambhala training, or I think also some other Buddhist sanghas develop a sort of non-religious track to their teachings. This is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking more about people with the phenomenon itself of secularized Buddhism, people who say, yeah, I want to belong to the Buddhist tradition, but in order to make sense in the current world, it has to be adapted in certain ways. Okay, my main source, I think, because I think is the clearest and also most articulate and I think most interesting to read is especially Stephen Batchelor. And the book I showed earlier, After Buddhism, I think is kind of more mature thought on the topic of Buddhism. But you can also read his kind of memoirs. What is it? Confessions of a Buddhist Atheist. Confessions. Or also he has a book called Buddhism Without Beliefs. I think that was his first ones. So you can read that. But his views have evolved a lot over the years. So I think After Buddhism is kind of the last stage. And actually, after the publication of this book, I listened also to an interview he did, I think with Bob Wright. And there he says, well, actually, these days, I don't want to call myself a Buddhist. I think it's become kind of a weight on my shoulders. And I prefer, now he uses the phrase post-Buddhism, I think, which is really a natural development of After Buddhism. That's what it means, yeah, post-Buddhism. But basically, that doesn't mean he doesn't still follow a lot of the Buddhist teachings. And so just for those of you who are not that familiar, the main features I'll try to go over very quickly. The main orientation of Stephen Batchelor's take on Buddhism, we could say, is that Buddhism should be seen as a pragmatic system of practice, yeah, pragmatic set of teachings. And this is set in opposition with metaphysical. Okay, so for him, the teachings of the Buddha, if you take them in their original spirit and sort of intent, they're not about finding out what reality is about. They're just about liberation. Okay. Anything, so you're probably familiar with some of those early Pali Sutras discourses where the Buddha says, you know, when you get hit by an arrow, you don't start asking who made it and where did it come from, at what speed did it hit me, and so forth. You just try to find the solution to the problem. Okay, so Batchelor takes that to mean the study of any view is irrelevant about reality. Buddhism just is not interested in finding out about reality. Okay, so that leads to some consequences. For example, the famous doctrine of the Four Noble Truths, or the Four Truths of the Noble Ones, according to some scholars. He just changes that to say, no, it's Four Noble Tasks. Okay, because otherwise it would be just the word truth, I think he doesn't like. So he said, no, our job is not to realize the truth of suffering, but is the task of accepting that suffering is there. Okay, and he applies that throughout to the Four Noble Truths. When he says metaphysical in opposition to pragmatic, it's a little bit tricky. I think those of you who study a little bit of philosophy and things like that, it's a bit different from the regular way I think we use these words. But on one hand, it means any theory on reality, for example, emptiness, or any Yogacara, whatever theory. He says, yeah, this is metaphysical. So they're about things about reality that we don't observe directly with our senses, and just trying to find doctrines and kind of dogmatic views on what reality is about. And he says this is useless and that won't help you for liberation. But he also means like general ways of explaining the world that we cannot really verify for ourselves. So for example, he's very famous for his position on rebirth and karma, and his position of agnosticism regarding rebirth, saying we cannot really know directly what happens after death. Therefore, I don't want to accept rebirth. I just want to say, I don't know what's going to happen. Okay. So that he takes also rebirth and karma to be a metaphysical doctrine in the same category as something like emptiness, for example. Whereas I think we in Buddhist tradition, we might consider these like two different kinds of doctrine. Yeah. When we say karma, we don't mean the same thing as emptiness in terms of level of use and so forth. Okay. He rejects anything having to do with truth, either directly or indirectly. So, for example, doctrine of two truths in Mahayana, he thinks this is completely bad and should be, rejected and blamed. He said there's only one truth, is the pragmatic truth of what works to be free from suffering. Any theory on reality is useless. But he also rejects concepts like bodhicitta, for example, because he says, in order to accept that idea, I also need to believe that there are infinite number of beings in different realms and different places, and they're stuck in samsara. And he says, oh, that's a metaphysical commitment that he doesn't want to make. Okay, so even if you're indirectly associated with sort of metaphysics, he said we have to get rid of all of that. So he basically wants to end up with Buddhism without beliefs, or as I call it, Buddhism without a view. Like just the basic attitude, I think we can call empirical, like what we can experience directly in our life through our senses, and sort of we find out what works, what causes suffering and so forth. And anything that's beyond that, we're not interested in, and Buddhism shouldn't be concerned about that at all. Okay, from the point of view of practice, the focus, I think, like many modernist authors, is the main practice, and sometimes you could say almost like the only practice, is mindfulness. Mindfulness of breathing, and there's body scans and things like that. But especially here, it's important to specify that it means mindfulness in the model we call bare awareness mindfulness, like this idea that you just pay attention to your breath, because some authors also debate that mindfulness doesn't really mean that. When you talk about right mindfulness, if you read, for example, a book by Thanissaro called Right Mindfulness, in the scripture, in the Pali Canon, for example, is much more described as applying a framework to your experience. And there can be different kinds of mindfulness practices. If you're going to be mindful about, never having angry thought, that's one way to practice mindfulness. Or if you want to be there's so many things you can be in mindfulness. But here is the idea that no, mindfulness just means being present to your direct situation, your body, your thoughts, and sort of having a sort of blank framework kind of approach to mindfulness. Bare awareness, I think that some people call it like that. Another focus is on rationality. For example, he will describe in his book After Buddhism that the benefits of mindfulness practice is that when a situation comes, instead of reacting with emotion, like being mindful gives you some space so you can actually decide how you're going to react. So somebody steps on your foot or honks in your ears on the street, and if you didn't have any mindfulness, then you might turn and scream or something like that. But if you do, then that gives you a space to say, oh, no, it's not going to be useful to get angry or to scream, so I'm going to rather do this. So there's a sense that mindfulness allows for rational determination of your behavior, as opposed to just being led by your emotional patterns, or what he calls reactivity. By the way, also that term reactivity is very important for him. In Buddhism, usually there are a lot of sutras that explain the cause of samsara is craving. Yeah, I think Sanskrit tanha, and tanya. And here he translates even that term as reactivity. Okay, because he wants everything to boil down to this idea that we're just governed by a sort of tendencies, kind of unconscious reactions. And the practice of mindfulness allows you to kind of get control over your behavior by applying rational methods. Because that's one way in which there's again emphasis on rationality, not just in being skeptical about views, but also as a practice in itself, for ethical behavior and even like mental cultivation. That being said, he doesn't reject any sort of mysticism. He was also highly influenced by, I think, time he spent in the Zen monastery, Korean Zen, I think, especially. But he describes this as the everyday sublime. So mystical experience should not be about finding a sort of a deeper level of reality or entering any kind of meditative absorption or, being lost in visions or dreams or anything like that. The mystical experience is just to have a very direct experience of our everyday, like, sense experience, and finding something beautiful or profound or mystical in there. Okay, so you could say this is very close to what you find in some Zen teachings, for example. Okay, wow, this is taking long. Continued. Okay, for him, what he describes corresponds not only to what he likes, or Protestant Buddhism, but also original Buddhism. He said this what I find important is what is there in the original teachings of the Buddha. And so all the other many different kinds of practices that arose in all the Buddhist philosophy and so forth, including Abhidharma, I think, these are just later developments, especially the whole of Mahayana and later Vajrayana Buddhism. He sees as probably more like influenced by non-Buddhist traditions in India, so-called Vedic, Hindu or Vedic traditions. And he said these are the kind of later, basically pollution of Dharma teachings. We should go to the original teachings of the Buddha, and it would sound like what he likes. Okay, so this is very common in British Buddhist studies from the 20th century. The idea that the good is the old, what is good is old. And by some kind of weird chance, it also happens to match what we consider to be good as Western Protestants, rationality, direct relation, with the Buddha, the teachings, and all of that. Okay, so the main themes are rationality, empiricism, and also skepticism. It's part of Buddhist practice not to, be sort of distracted by metaphysical views and views about reality. This just becomes another obstacle. In that light, he talks a lot about dogmatism and orthodoxy, and types of Buddhism that focus on having the right view are, he sees, like degenerations of the Buddhist teachings. Especially, I think in the beginning of his career as a Buddhist student, he studied with a Gelugpa institution in Switzerland, where they focused a lot on philosophy and having the right view. And he describes that in his book as being a very negative experience that basically disgusted him from the whole of Buddhist philosophy. So he sees that, all this focus on philosophy and having the right view, debate and study is kind of completely against the basic approach of Dharma teachings. Okay, so it's not just that some views are not pragmatically relevant and useful for liberation. Being interested in views at all, should not be a Buddhist practice. None of them are useful. Okay, so what are my then points of discussion with this view here? Here I put a couple of my own evaluations. So one problem is the idea of exclusivism. Okay, if somebody, for me personally, I don't feel that strongly about barbecuing those people and all of that, because especially if somebody says, I'm not interested in Buddhist philosophy, or I'm not interested in Mahayana, or I'm not interested in doing visualization practice or getting blessings from the deity, that's fine. I mean, I really don't have a problem with that. Like, I don't feel like everybody should become Buddhist, and follow these things. I don't have a problem. What is more problem for us is saying those people who do that are not really Buddhist. So making a judgment from the outside on Buddhist tradition, and especially saying there's only one kind of right view and all the others are kind of wrong. Historically wrong, yeah, historically they're kind of later developments that are not authentic. Also, they won't lead to any kind of liberation. So all those monks like studying philosophy, all those RYI students, they're all wasting their time. And they're only there because they're dogmatic or they have kind of wrong tendency. So he's trying to be, I think, against a dogmatic attitude, but he ends up doing a little bit the opposite, like being very exclusivist. Like there's only one view, is mine. And is that of original Buddhism is the one that matches our expectations. So that I'm a little bit uncomfortable with. And especially the idea that I'm even more uncomfortable with is that, somebody who still is interested in Buddhist philosophy or in study of views like emptiness, dependent arising, and all of that is necessarily irrational and has failed to appreciate sort of the development of culture into a modern sort of rationalistic model. And therefore, sooner or later, it will eventually evolve in that, all kinds of Buddhism will become this sort of Buddhist modernism. That I'm very uncomfortable with from many points of view. First of all, because I'm not convinced at all that his view is more rational than the kind of the Buddhist view. I think that debate has not taken place. That's still up for question. We can still talk about that. And second, I think it really kind of seems to be based on a lot of assumptions that eventually all cultures of the world will evolve into kind of Western culture. Like everybody eventually will kind of reach enlightenment and become scientific, rational, and all of that. And I just don't see any reason to believe that, other than thinking that it's superior and everything should go there eventually. And yeah, I don't see why we should believe that. But anyway, now that he said he's not a Buddhist, maybe then I don't have to be that concerned. Okay, if non-Buddhists want to say, oh, we're interested in only mindfulness or compassion training, things like that, I don't think I have a big problem with that. I'm more concerned about those who are themselves in that tradition and sort of trying to figure out for themselves or for ourselves, and I'm including myself in that, and thinking, why do I need to study this view? Like, is it really important, and where does it really fit? And especially since we all live in the modern world, and this kind of view of reality as kind of being based on science and rationality and so forth is kind of everywhere, a little bit present. So what is the place of Buddhist philosophy in that world? So I think that's still a valid question we can all ask for ourselves. And especially, is it, as a Buddhist practitioner, like, is it really important to study that view? Or can we also ourselves take our own version of pragmatic approach and say, no, I'm just going to do the meditation and the practice and everything is fine? Okay, that's a good question. And of course, probably all of this is very much determined by my time here at RYI, where constantly we're being reminded of the importance of the scholar practitioner model. Don't study only for the sake of, enjoyment of philosophical arguments, or to think you're very clever, or for a career, or I don't know what, to get a better room, but really apply that to your own experience. And exactly how to do that, I think, is still not always 100% clear, and it's good to reflect on those questions. Or for me, it's interesting anyway. Finally, so I thought, a lot of people then think, okay, is he a Buddhist? Is it okay to call yourself a Buddhist even though you have this secularized view? And here, there are different approaches. I think there's a book by, again, Dzongzar Chese called What Makes You Not a Buddhist, where he uses also doctrinal criteria, like those 4 seals: impermanence, suffering, emptiness, and no self, these things. But I thought it's interesting to look through the lens of Atisha, and especially in text Lamp for the Path, Bodhi, Pata, Pradipa. There he talks about 3 types of individuals. The inferior individual practices morality and so forth for the sake of happiness only in next life. And the medium capacity individual practices for sake of individual liberation. And the superior one practices for the sake of all sentient beings and to liberate them. So I think here maybe we have to make a 4th type, this kind of inferior tier, no, low tier inferior. That means practicing Buddhist teachings for the sake of happiness in this life. So not even in next life, but maybe, and still wanting to call yourself Buddhist maybe for that reason. But no, I don't think we have to change the text, but I thought that's also a nice way of doing it, based on motivation. And I think it tells us something interesting, which is, if you don't have a view of the reality that allows, for the goal of liberation to be formulated in future life, at least, or in general, then how can you have the motivation for liberation at all? How does it make sense? Okay, Olaf, next one. Okay, so discussion. How do we answer those points? I think in this context, I don't need to spend too much time. The first question is he fair to things like emptiness and two truths doctrine? And here, I think, not really. I don't feel like he's raising a very difficult challenge to Buddhist view, because what he criticizes when he criticizes emptiness as a metaphysical doctrine, like, is just either what we call a straw man or just a misunderstanding. Every day you'll hear this in class here. If you take emptiness as a metaphysical theory or a dogmatic view on reality, that's just a misunderstanding. That's not the point. And the two truths doctrine allow you to understand that ultimately there's really not much you can say about reality. And the reality is not captured by concepts and words. That's the two truths doctrine. And so whatever you say, whether it's karma or even the language of emptiness, non-duality, in the end is provisional. And the ultimate truth is that, it's beyond our concepts. Okay, but the very fact that he rejects two truths doctrine at all makes it impossible for him to appreciate that point. So if you have a one truth version of reality and you try to understand emptiness, you will end up with dogmatic view, and it will be a kind of crazy theory, a nihilistic theory or something like that. So in one way he's right, but if he gave a fair reading to that theory or that doctrine, or how actually the study of views is used in Buddhist traditions, then you would maybe get a more nuanced understanding of it. So I don't think that's very difficult to answer. But also the idea that views of reality or not practically relevant. They don't play a function on the path to liberation. That I think we can also answer very quickly. Yeah, for example, renunciation. Yeah, you can observe the world and see that, you know, there's a lot of frustration, whatever you do, whatever you pursue. But with some understanding of things like emptiness, and renunciation is even more powerful. When you realize that all those games, you know, all happen within the realm of things, just human projection of things that are based on nothing real, you have even more renunciation, yeah, and even less interest in those little games. Same thing for compassion, yeah. When people suffer, but you realize they suffer based on complete kind of illusory reasons without need, and that increases the compassion. And also, like for a Buddhist, yeah, emptiness is not just there to have the right view or to win in debate or to make sure that, you know, you have the superior philosophy to your opponents. Like, is directly relevant for liberation. Actually, we could say from perspective of Mahayana Buddhism, if there is no emptiness, there would not be possibility for liberation at all. Like, we would be stuck. Yeah, that would be very depressing, no? Actually, here the sense is, no, there is a reality. It happens to be emptiness, and you can realize it. You can understand it. Okay, so there are practices like, we have concepts like prajna, vipassana. We take, these are directly involving those views, not just as theories, but directly as something to try to apply in your experience. Shamatha, vipassana, and so forth. And of course, that's at the basis of all Buddhist practice, at least from Mahayana perspective. I think that applies to other kinds of Buddhism as well. Okay, so in a sense, he kind of takes a cheap version of emptiness as his main object of criticism, and therefore doesn't really touch on the main issue. So from that point of view, I think it's quite easy to answer. Okay, but if you get a proper understanding of emptiness and two truths, then you can see that, no, it is itself a critique of metaphysics, of metaphysical views, of attachment to views. And even I feel personally that is a much more powerful critique of metaphysics than to say it's irrelevant, but is to say, to prove logically that, yeah, reality cannot be captured by our fabrications and language. It's quite beyond that. Yeah. Not only that, like all the theories you can come up with kind of fail and end up being sort of absurd and incoherent, but you can convince yourself, you can show decisively that you cannot come with any theory on reality that was going to work and that's going to be rationally, possible. And so you're left with that possibility of saying, okay, if I want to find reality, I have to find some other method. Okay, so in a sense, emptiness theory in Tutor does what Batchelor would like, sort of complete rejection of metaphysics, but from my point of view, in a much more powerful way. His approach, I think, doesn't go very far. Okay, it also comes, and this is very important, I think, for this discussion, with the idea that whatever other theory we have about reality, karma, rebirth, all the divisions of the path, the aggregates, description of reality, logic, everything is provisional. The things that are really true in every context, or we call in Buddhist theory definitive meaning, is a very small ensemble of things. Okay, that varies according to different schools, but it's a very restricted set of views, like, for example, only emptiness. Yeah, so the only thing we can say is that the rest is only always provisional. I think also Zongzar Chense said this in the lecture. He said the rest is all, in a sense, a lie to some extent. At some point, you have to give it up. Okay, it's only provisional for the sake of getting further. Okay, so in that sense, truth is pragmatically relevant. If you relate it to liberation, yeah, it plays many functions. First of all, because you can realize it. So you can actually, liberation is possible. And also because it gives meaning to many things. It gives you a sense of where you're going. But also because it allows you to have all kinds of things in your life, like karma, rebirth, stages of the path, and so forth, without being committed to a metaphysical view and without falling into extreme views. Okay, just using them for the sake of, reaching your goal, which is liberation. Okay, so I'll take it. Make sense? So why then does Batchelor not see that? What he criticizes as emptiness is kind of a cheap version of what Buddhists practice and what Buddhists believe. Why is he so convinced of that point? But despite all his kind of effort at reading sutras and all his years of studying in monasteries, why does he fail to see that point? And here I think this is something that actually is a very interesting issue for me, is that he is still committed. This is my hypothesis. I don't know, of course, what he feels or thinks, but I think he, and I think it's not only him, I think it's many people, still committed in some sense to the view that we call metaphysical realism. And the idea that reality is quite independent for what we take it to be. Okay? Especially this is associated with something they call scientific realism. Okay? Basically, this is based on the naturalistic view of reality. You know, the world came from Big Bang, and then all those things got together, and eventually there's a planet, and then some cells appear, and eventually there's life and animal life and consciousness, and then eventually that evolves into human beings, and then they develop those abstractions and things like that out of evolution. Okay, but the basic sense is that what's real is matter, the material world, and the realm of ideas, consciousness, and whatever we do through our logic, that is just a side effect. Okay, now this is closely associated with the idea of mind-body dualism, that consciousness is a byproduct of the brain. Yeah, you can see through evolution that consciousness arises eventually in history as a side product of evolution of animals. And so therefore, for example, when the brain doesn't have blood and oxygen and all of that, then consciousness ceases. Okay, awareness, there's no awareness left. So I think people like Stephen Batchelor are committed to that view. They think that if you believe in evolution theory, for example, you kind of also have to believe in that. Okay, so in other words, the metaphysical realism and mind-body dualism is established as a scientific theory. Science proves that consciousness is a side effect of the material aspect of reality. Okay. So my question is, so is this a metaphysical theory itself? Or is this kind of a view you can have without being committed to metaphysical views, the thing that the Bachelor wants to avoid? And here I take myself, I feel that on these issues, I side more on the Buddhist side. I say, yeah, that is a metaphysical theory. Like, how can you prove scientifically that consciousness arises from matter? Okay. What kind of scientific experiment do you do to prove that? Does evolution theory reprove that? How exactly does that work? And here, when you find also, once I had a chance to discuss this with Alan Wallace, and he's involved in a lot of discussions with the scientists. And he said, yeah, I talked to those guys and I just asked them, like, okay, mind comes from matter. How do you define matter? What's the definition? And he said, they don't have a definition. It's very difficult to define those things. Or what is your definition of consciousness? Like, how do you define consciousness? It's really not that simple. But there's a sense that is so kind of deeply shared. It's kind of a commonly shared belief by many people in the culture that people don't need to define it. It's kind of assumed to be like that. And if you don't believe it, you're not quite scientific, not quite rational. But if you ask also what it means, then we don't really have an answer. But we know that just the fact that you ask shows that you're a sort of religious zealot or something like that. Okay, so I think he's committed to that view. And from a Buddhist perspective, for me, that's a metaphysical theory. Actually, we have books on this, Charvaka, or Jangpempa, or materialist, or even the Buddhists will call this nihilism, the proponents of annihilation. Also, yeah, we have a tradition of discussing that view, and we don't consider that to be a very difficult view to, argue against. It falls very quickly on self-contradictions. It's funny, on Saturday, Rinpoche was talking about this, yeah, and how it is dangerous. It's a very dangerous view that if you have a lot of technological power for nuclear weapons and you don't have any view on sort of any religious kind of ethic or morality to guide you, that would be much more dangerous than somebody with a kind of what we would consider generally in West modern culture now in the West, kind of a religious fanatic, He said, no, what's more dangerous is a nihilistic person. And that view is actually very tricky because it doesn't believe in karma, rebirth, or even if it's God, for example, that decides on some kind of universal morality. At least there's a sense of an overarching moral structure. But this view leads to a very kind of what I see as a very sort of disenchanted view of the world. where your existence doesn't really have meaning. You're here as a side effect of your body evolving out of those atoms, whatever organisms. And at the time of death, that's it, that's the end. And so you can try to be a good person or try to be happy, but in the end, really it doesn't make a big difference. And so, for example, imagine you're the only ethically behaving person in a country. You say, no, I want to do the right thing, and everybody else is cheating. No, you can end up discouraged. Whereas if you have view of karma, rebirth, or you're going somewhere else, there's different notion on sense making. But especially for me, the emphasis is that, yeah, you can't just assume that to be the case because, for example, of evolution theory, because if you ask in detail what exactly is the proof for those views, yeah, that, for example, consciousness comes out of matter and so forth, it's not that easy to prove. It's quite easy to criticize. Okay, so I think one of the issues is that people are raised in that kind of view, or they take that as kind of intuitive notion of how reality works. Especially when you start studying biology and things like that, yeah, you see it, yeah, okay, this animal has more consciousness, things like that, and then you tend to see reality as being present in the things you can observe, the things you can measure, and that takes over sort of your sense for what is real. Next one. Okay. The next one is question of karma and rebirth, yeah? And a lot of those authors like Bob Wright and Batchelor and so forth, I think Batchelor will say agnostic, but a lot of them will just say outright, yeah, no, we don't believe in karma. Like it's much more likely that there's no rebirth at all. And therefore the notion that the actions you will commit in this life will carry over, as causal forces that for your future experiences, like they see as a really weird sort of based on mythical view of reality and pre-modern view of the world, where there's some sort of universal justice. And I think they see it as the Buddhists didn't really have a God, like to have a universal justice. So they came up with kind of the best they could. So they could have at least some sense of universal morality. Okay. Of course, they don't believe in two truths. So they have to see, oh, okay, all of this has to be real, like in the ultimate sense, whatever cause exists. And and that always leads to the issue of, if you're going to be reborn, there needs to be something, that's really real that's going to be reborn. You really don't really have the capacity to understand rebirth without a self, a real self. Okay, so I think that's an interesting perspective. But me, I'd like to switch that around and ask the question rather, if you don't accept karma and rebirth, then what do you have to believe in? Like, how can you have that view? And kind of what does that tell about your beliefs if you believe that after death, is the end of consciousness, and that the actions you commit in this life won't carry any sort of effect later on? I think it shows a commitment to mind-body dualism. And you basically, if you kind of have to believe that consciousness stopped with the body, and also metaphysical realism, that our sort of arguments we can make about reality really don't have anything to say about reality itself. Like, we don't have access to reality. And so even if we show that it's incoherent, reality doesn't care in a sense. Okay. We already talked about some of those points, and especially the fact that in sort of quite long time, like a long time ago in Buddhism, they considered this view, Charvaka, or what we could translate these days as kind of materialist or material realism, as nihilism. And the people who believe in annihilation. And that's always interesting that in the beginning, I think in the early sources, it's not about views like emptiness, reality. It's really about what happens at the time of death. And these are the people who believe in annihilation. Okay. And the interesting thing here is, I don't know, I think that's an interesting idea. Maybe you have good feedback about that. Like, how can you imagine that consciousness completely disappears? Like, for me, it's very difficult to imagine that. Like, the complete disappearance of awareness that goes into complete, like, you have to be able to conceive a complete void of experience. And there's really nothing in our experience that looks like that. Whenever we think of anything, even a material object, we always think of it as an object of awareness. So to imagine that there's a state of completely no awareness, or maybe you can imagine the early stages of the universe before there's any conscious life, like just this dry state of matter that where nobody perceives it. I think this is the annihilation they're talking about. Like to be able to believe that your consciousness will go into complete nothingness, okay, and that will exist forever. Okay. Then of course you have to give up belief in things like causality. Of course, the Buddhist version of causality applied to action is a very specific thing. Yeah? It's not just causality in general. It's the idea that your motivations and the effects of your action end up being sort of causes for your future experiences. Okay, but in Buddhism, we generally consider that to be general belief in cause and effect. You know, otherwise, how do you explain where your experiences come from? Okay, so in other words, you have to also give up causality and believe in kind of randomness of your experiences in life. Especially there are moral, or even you could say political connotations here. But if you don't believe in karma, and there's nothing, you know, to explain that things are fair or just in life. Yeah. So in Buddhism, I think the general sense is that people suffer all kinds of terrible consequences because of karma. So we try to help them. Yeah. We would like to help them suffer less of that. But it's not like we're responsible to make sure that they get the right results from their action. Okay. But in a sense, in this world, in this kind of nihilistic worldview, there's a sense that, you know, there's no justice. So if somebody suffers something and it's unfair, then it's kind of your job to fix that. Okay. Now that's very different from helping other people who suffer from their karma. For me, that means you're responsible to make things right, for making things right. Okay. And especially combined with the nihilistic view, this is where I think what Rinpoche was saying about this is very dangerous. It could lead to very scary things. Like I will make things right, yeah, so that people get what they deserve. Okay, and I'm very happy as a Buddhist that you don't have that responsibility. Okay, it's not to help people get what they deserve. That's not our job. That's just a natural law. You know, our job is to help people kind of have less suffering and yourself get out of suffering if possible. But anyway, that's just a side issue. But maybe I don't know. You'll have ideas about it. Basically, you have to become God. I don't want that. Okay, then this leads also, for me, this is an interesting philosophical question also, the importance of the view, right? What is the importance of having the right view? Like, for example, I never felt strongly, even as a Buddhist, that, for example, somebody could practice yoga as a Shaiva practitioner, and you could reach like some quite high level of realization and be quite good, you know? And I would feel uncomfortable saying, oh, no, you will never get free because, you know, you believe in some kind of subtle way in theistic views or something like that. Okay, I think, you know, we can say that, you know, there's a variety of views and no view is completely perfect. So in that sense, maybe even some practitioners from other religions, we can say they reach quite good level of morality, there's mental development, spiritual cultivation, things like that. So of course, there's a lot of emphasis on the right view, but it's not, for me, like, I'm not sure the main point, or anyway, I'm just thinking about this, so you can help me. But the main point is, it really like, you will not get free or liberated if you don't have the exact correct right view. I think that's the idea that Stephen Batchelor doesn't like. Is the right view necessary for liberation? Like, I don't think necessarily. For example, we have a lot of stories in Tibetan tradition of people who just out of devotion, maybe if they don't have really good like mental intelligence or something like that, or maybe half, you know, not super sharp, you know, intelligence and things like that, they can still get liberation simply through devotion, for example. So I'm quite comfortable with that idea. But again, this importance of right view that Stephen Batchelor thinks is so wrong, I like to consider switching around and the other way around. Rather is, what is the negative effect of wrong views? You know, how can that prevent you from being free? You know? And here I think maybe we have more in common. I'm not sure if that's really what the Batchelor sees, but we can apply a criticism of views, especially when understood in the wrong way. Especially if you have views that you're, a lot of them are associated with negative emotions. Yeah, views that certain type of people deserve, you know, what they get when they get suffering, you know, or that some people are essentially superior or something like that. Or yeah, things like in traditionally we'll say that there's no karma, no rebirth, actions have no consequences. Even if you hurt others, there are no consequences. You won't suffer anything like that. Or wrong views, I think, will usually also involve things like, yeah, the world is created by God, and the way to be free is to do the right thing, and so forth. That becomes an obstacle. But especially, and this, I think, even a bachelor maybe can accept, because it's taught in early Buddhism, is that attachment to views is a problem. You know, we have a lot of attachments in life, yeah, to material things, pleasure, fame, and so forth, but also to views. And this is a part, I think, that if we don't give the importance to views, for example, by practicing Buddhism simply as a set of techniques, like to completely pragmatic and paying no attention to views, I think it's likely that some views you're attached to will, you know, not be uprooted. Or in other words, you won't be able to solve your attachment to views. And this is a point, I think, where when we ask the importance of studying philosophy or studying the view, is very important. Like, what views or assumptions do we have about reality? And that can become an obstacle for us, you know, in our own practice or liberation, or in our behavior, and so forth. And I find that sometimes, yeah, we are attached to a lot of views in general, very strong things, like especially in any given society, there are a lot of things probably that if you don't accept, like, you'll be heavily criticized, or you won't be part of the group, or you know, you will be considered a bad person, or you will consider that if people don't believe such and such views, like they're not proper members of your group, they're bad, and so forth. And for me, the idea that you can practice Buddhism and attain liberation and be able to keep all of those views intact, and not realize at some point that, oh, I have to give up my attachment even to those, is problematic. Yeah, there needs to be also not only giving up attachment to fame, wealth, and so forth, but also to views. And how do you do that? How do you get rid of attachment to views? And I think the process of studying view and studying what we call right view is not just to have the right orthodox view, but rather is to be able to notice the things we're attached to that are not really based on reality, and maybe are based on negative emotions, or based on false opinions that are not, you know, useful. And that's also a kind of process that's very important. And so in some of the tradition, I think, especially famous, I think Tsongkhapa says this, is that you can practice shamatha and kind of meditation and kind of take care of your course on negative emotions, but to uproot the really deep sense of ego clinging, you need to use analytic meditation and really try to bring into light the things you're still attached to, and that shape your understanding of reality in a deep way, and be able to get free from that. Because there are things like ideology that really shape our understanding of how we live in the world, really change our reaction to things. And this kind of model that Bachelor is proposing, I think, will kind of propose the idea that you just practice your meditation and everything goes wrong and your views stay exactly the same. Whereas actually, I think you have to be prepared to give up some of those views. Actually, honestly, I think basically you have, if you ask like, which of my views that I'm attached to, political, scientific, whatever, aesthetic, which one will I have to give up in order to be awakened, is basically all of them. Yeah. So, but that's not easy. It can be harder to give up attachment to views than attachment to money or something like that. So anyway, I think that's an interesting thing to think about. So attachment to wrong views or attachment to views in general can be a problem. Basically, if you take seriously this theory of emptiness or two truths, in the end, all of these views, you have to be free from being attached to them. Okay, so I think, and I asked the question in the beginning, what can we learn from this? I think is, as a Buddhist, it's always a good point to say, how can I use this to analyze my own perspective? We're supposed to be nangpa, people who look for a solution to things inside and not by fixing the world outside. So the question is, okay, is Bachelor making a point where actually we can learn something we can apply for ourselves? And I think personally, yes. Okay, especially in one of the courses, we're reading the academic philosophers and how they study Madhyamaka philosophy. And one of the things that came out is that a lot of them tried to understand Madhyamaka, so the theory of two truths and emptiness, but while being compatible or consistent with a view of metaphysical realism. So I think they're creating a new school of Madhyamaka called the Charvaka Madhyamaka. And they think somehow that is compatible by saying that all of Madhyamaka arguments really apply only to sort of the linguistic aspect of reality, and sort of correlating with what they call the linguistic turn, in 20th century philosophy. They think that they can apply all of that, and then when they go home, they still believe, that mind-body dualism and things like that. So it doesn't really affect their understanding of reality directly. That's one way. But also, I think for all of us, we can think, oh, okay, am I still myself somewhat committed to this view of metaphysical realism? Like, how I can understand those Madhyamaka arguments and all of that, but, in the rest of my life, like, don't I still believe that, in the end, how is my attachment to that view really completely uprooted by that? And are there kind of deeper tendencies to believe that what is real is material? Maybe because of our upbringing, because if you have, for example, basically a scientific education, there's a lot of connotation of that. Even though maybe you don't have a proof of that, or it's treated as a theory, you kind of learn to believe that. Also, because this view maybe is very sort of intuitive, kind of for uneducated human beings to think that, what is real is there. If you want to know if something is real, you try to touch it. If you can touch it, you say, it's real. I can touch it. Okay, so I think that's interesting to ask for ourselves, like, okay, which one of those views am I really free myself, for example, from that view? And especially the question I want to ask is, can you still make sense to be a Buddhist and to be engaged in Buddhist practice and Buddhist philosophy, and yet be able to retain that view of reality? Does that work? Are those two things compatible? Now, if we look at ancient Indian philosophy and the teachings of the masters, they said absolutely not. Like, these are complete opposites, like fire and water. They don't work. But I think it's quite acceptable in many places to say, I'm a Buddhist, but of course I still believe in the world like we learn it in school and things like that. And somehow that's supposed to work. But for me, that leads to so many problems, like that it makes Buddhist practice like very shallow, or in the end, it falls apart and it's not going to work. Or you won't be able to believe it really works. Like, for example, if you study the view and the arguments and you say, okay, now I understand emptiness. But reality is quite separate from our views, like our understanding. Then what is the use of that emptiness? It's just that, I got the right view. I can write a paper and I can get the credentials, but it won't really change your relation with reality directly. Okay. Or if you do have maybe by some chance, some direct experience of reality, maybe a glimpse, in your meditation practice, but you're still committed to the metaphysical realism, then how does that make sense? How will you? There's something weird's going on with me, or something like that. Okay, so I think that's an interesting question to consider. And so, therefore, I think, that's good now. Exactly 1 hour. Usually, I don't do that so good. I'm done with my slides. So, in conclusion, I just want to say, I think there is something to be learned for ourselves. Not, of course, maybe some people want to barbecue Stephen Batchelor. Of course, I think that's a bit of a joke, but I think in not just kind of blaming that view, but try to understand why we think is not very good, we can learn something about ourselves. And especially for me, that helped me find a lot of good arguments for saying, okay, why is it still relevant to study philosophy and the view, and ask ourselves, like, what place does that have in my own practice, as a Buddhist? In this, if you are interested in this model of scholar practitioner, of saying, not only the general principle of I want to study these views in order to apply to my life, okay, but how exactly is that going to happen? And then we get a lot of material here to deal with, by finding the views I'm still attached to, by seeing how my own perspective of the world is shaped by ideologies or beliefs and things like that, and also by really getting clear on how does this all work, that our understanding of reality really leads to liberation. Is because there is a certain vision of reality that the Buddhist teachings have, in which that makes sense. And otherwise, the other model of simply practice, to be rational and not do the wrong thing, and anyway, at the end of your life, you will get liberation by annihilation or whatever. I don't know if you consider that a liberation or something. I don't know. For me, that's just a strange concept. That can really deepen, I think, our understanding of the importance of those things, the value, and also like for those people who take class and sometimes it's a bit boring, Abhidharma and the Madhyamaka and all of that. That's the way to show, no, if you think about what that effect can have on your life, it's not boring. For example, this view of emptiness as two truths, union of two truths. If you correlate that with your experience, it's quite a fantastic thing, you know. It's quite amazing. But anyway, you have to be able to appreciate for what it is. So I think I'll stop here. I'm more interested in your, I think, questions and comments and criticism especially. So thanks for your attention, and sorry for the long 1 hour sitting and listening to all of that. But anyway, that's where I am so far. Question, Julia?
Okay, I will start. Yes. First of all, thank you for this thought-provoking talk. You have read Bachelor much better than I. Mine is a long time ago, but there's one point where I would want to defend him when you say that he has, in terms of morality and ethics, a nihilistic view. What I remember reading, and now I will put it in my words, so maybe it's more me than him. He was saying that if we analyze why we are acting in morally good ways, it is not because we think there's a consequence in next life. Yeah, I'm not telling myself, okay, I'm not going to murder my neighbor and take his wealth because I think next life I will be reborn in hell. No, why? Because I have a dignity in myself, and you could call it Buddha nature or sanity, and that is why I don't do it. And there are consequences to it. So I wouldn't say that he doesn't believe in cause and effect, but the consequences that he is talking about, obviously they're within one life. He says, yeah, you will be tortured by guilt and bad conscience, at least most people who are healthy-minded would be. And that is reason enough to behave in certain ways. And I thought there is a certain truth to it. Of course, I would also say it belongs into the realm of metaphysical realism, but at least I wouldn't say he is a total nihilist. So in terms of this argument that to be a humanist can be strong enough to become a good human being and walk towards liberation, what would you answer there?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for that precision. That's a good point. I didn't want to suggest, maybe I didn't express myself clearly enough, that he's a moral nihilist or amoral or anything like that. But rather that I was talking about the view of karma as a kind of natural law of causality, where our actions will bring an effect directly in the future. Now, you can have a kind of a light version of karma where, you know, you will immediately feel unhappy if you act based on anger and things like that, and that's totally fine. And I think what you're naming is one of the weak replies to this theory by traditional Buddhists that we hear a lot. Oh, if you don't believe in karma, then everybody will go and steal the bank and there won't be any consequences. Whereas you can go to countries where people don't believe in karma or God and actually behave quite decently. Whereas in places where people believe in karma, like in India maybe, or Nepal, you won't leave your door unlocked very long, or your keys and your car the same way. So this is a bit kind of a cheap way to answer that. So I'm glad you're making that position. So that's not what I wanted to say. But I think in Buddhism, we have also this idea that actions that are punya, you feel right away the positive action, but also in the future, you know, they will bring a good result. Whereas here, it's just only half of that is that, oh, the positive is there right away. But of course, that goes into some problems also, because there are some people who behave in an awful way and they don't seem to feel any guilt at all. They seem to enjoy it. Anyway, they seem like they're fine. So lots of problems. And then also sometimes they get a lot of good things happening to them. And so that leads to another sense of how things work. But me, I was talking more about the fact of how do you explain the reasons behind the experiences that you're having in life? Where do they come from? Like how can you explain, you know, that you have such and such, you're born in such and such condition, and so things happen to you. And for this is I think the nihilist part, where you say, well, there's no cause, we don't know, it's random, and it's kind of based on whatever the effects of the Big Bang, you know, things like that. It's only that aspect. Yeah. Of course, you can be totally moral without believing in karma or God. That's totally fine. But there's also a risk that you can convince yourself either through scientific investigation or rational analysis that, oh, the only solution we have is to use the nuclear bomb, for example, and destroy half of humanity. And if you make really, somebody convinces you with a rational argument, there's nothing left to say, oh, wait a minute, no, that's just not possible in, you know, at all in any situation. You have to stop, for example, because there's no kind of end to all of that. So that's the nuance I'd like to make. But thanks for that precision. Yeah, he's definitely not. Stephen Batchelor, I think, would emphasize morality more than traditional Buddhists in many senses. It's very important for him. So we have to be fair on that point.
Thank you for giving a really wonderful presentation. Have you watched the debate between Theravadan monk Ajahn Brahmali and Stephen Batchelor? There's on YouTube. I was looking for a debate between like the person who has different views than Buddhist, and I came up with this debate. Out of all the searches, I mean, this is the only debate on YouTube, and it was wonderful. I mean, at that time, I think my affinity was more towards Stephen Batchelor. I don't know why. I mean, although Ajahn Brahmali indirectly said, "You're not a Buddhist at all." I mean, he said it right. I mean, indirectly. And so my question is, why do you think he came up with this new school? I'll say school, I mean, because out of 5 traditional school, he's now coming with a new school. Why do you think the switch happened in his mind?
Yeah, no, I haven't seen that debate, but thanks for pointing it out. I'm going to look it up. That sounds interesting. It's true that there are not a lot of debates, but also there's a lot of people who say, oh, you should debate Stephen Batchelor and so forth. But for me, no, for there to be a proper debate, there needs to be also rules for that debate and like how it really works and how, and often it's just more like rhetorics and who sounds like they're more confident. So I'm more interested in a friendly Dharma conversation where we try to exchange and understand each other. But as to how he came to that point, I can only guess. Yeah, I mean, when we read his memoirs, we have a sense. I think I have a hypothesis that, but of course, it's completely guess. Yeah, but that he was a very curious, skeptical, kind of philosophical mind, and then he went to that Gelugpa school, and they put him in the program like basically designed for kids, for 11-year-olds, going to be 12 years, you know, in the Tatsang. And that didn't work with him at all, you know, because they start with very rough, like this is right, learn the Tarik, Lorik, and Abhidharma, and Sema, and so forth. And then towards the end, you start kind of applying that as criticism and self-criticism or debate. And so I think, yeah, maybe he ended up in the wrong school, something like that. But I also think that he's, I don't know, he's happy with the kind of this view, this metaphysical realist view. He thinks he's from a generation where I think people moved away from religion. They saw a lot of negative effects of religion, and they thought, oh, now we've kind of outgrown that. And for example, in my country, in Canada, there's a lot of people just stopped going to church, like within 20 years, yeah, it's empty. They said, okay, we've moved beyond that. And they had a lot of negative connotations associated with that. And they thought you can just change the institutions and sort of the discourse and you'll be free of all the negative things of religious culture. Whereas I think looking back is much deeper than that, you know. Our attachment to views is not just about being part of a certain religion. You can be a very dogmatic atheist, very dogmatic secularist person. And, you know, it's more complicated and it's deeper than that. Also, you cannot become a totally rational person. Just take a 3-year degree in science, and then you're able to just apply completely objective analysis, and your emotions won't kind of warp the way you work. Like it's much more complicated. You know, we're more complicated than that as human beings. So I think it's from that generation, and probably, yeah, didn't have the right kind of the teachers to really give him something that matched, like something that would work with him. I think he had a positive experience in the Korean monastery. So that's fine, yeah, for that. And even in some Zen teachers, we find they say, "Oh, there's no rebirth," or they really don't emphasize that at all, because they want to focus really directly on the direct experience. And so maybe he's more comfortable with that. But I also think he's looking for a kind of Buddhism that's not like just kind of Asian style that you transport in the West, but something that you can practice as somebody living in Europe, for example, and just be very simple and in continuity with local culture and something like that. So I don't know, but I'm just guessing. I don't think he is the one who wants to destroy Buddhism or anything like that. And yeah, I think he's happy with that kind of practice. That suits his motivations, his needs. So that's it. And there's a lot of people who also see it like that. And but yeah, I don't know. I don't know more than that. Yes, Shireen. Microphone necessary or?
Thank you. Oh,
I think it's on.
hi. So nice to have you back in RYI. And I think you know I love this topic of yours. So maybe I'm going to put together what Julia said with then something that happened to me this summer in going to all these teachings by Rinpoche. Because Rinpoche has really been ratcheting up, actually, the affirmation of religion in the way that you just repeated. So all summer long, Rinpoche was saying, it's much better to have a religious view of any kind than a Charvaka view or a materialist view. And then Rinpoche did something extremely interesting in Gomde, Austria, which is that he asked us, do we more believe in science or do we more believe in religion? He didn't say Buddhism. And people were really stumped with that kind of. And so now, because I was going to say something similar to Julia, that like nihilism, materialism doesn't necessarily have to be like a non-humanism, right? So I think that actually probably the discomfort that I experienced when Rinpoche wanted us to just say one way or the other, do we more believe in religion or more believe in science, was what kind of response could you give to the idea of kind of a post-foundationalist humanism or post-foundational ethics? Because I think, so Batchelor is trying to kind of strip Buddhism of its spiritual trappings to kind of get at this idea of a post-foundationalist humanism or ethics. So how can traditional Buddhist philosophy respond to that? Is there a, because I don't know if they had that in India, and I don't know actually Indian philosophy, like is a Charvaka view, would it, is it like a subset of that? So is there a room for a post-foundational ethics or humanism, and how does the traditional Buddhist view respond to that? So that's what I felt like I was confronted with this summer when Rinpoche was insisting we say whether we more believe in science or more believe in religion. I don't know if that made any sense, but it made sense to me.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure I completely understood, but I think so, at least partially. In that, so in relation to that, one of the things I started thinking about that I think is useful in this context is that there's a really nice book called 7 Types of Atheism by John Gray. He's a UK philosopher. It's very fun to read. And one of the things he shows is that even the atheistic views often reproduce and share a lot of the theistic views they are negating. A lot of the Western, for example, post-religious ideologies like Marxism or evolution or whatever, all those kinds, they retain a lot of the features of the religious kind of wider culture they come from. And so often you end up with kind of a light version of what was already there in the previous religious culture. Now, in the case of Buddhism, what that would look like, that would be interesting to see. Because I think Batchelor really brings a lot of more Western worldview into this. It's not like taking Buddhism in a sort of continuity and just getting rid of the spiritual elements. I think that's been done in various cultures. That might look like Vipassana, for example. that developed in Southeast Asia in 19th, 20th century. Here, him is more of a hybrid between some elements of modern culture, which I think are still very Judeo-Christian in their view of reality. Like, for example, for me, this metaphysical realism, that is still very much Judeo-Christian. I mean, these are big questions. Yeah, I don't want to be questioned on this too much. These are just kind of general intuitions. So this is where maybe it's a little bit clunky in the case of a bachelor. Whereas in some things like Marxism, people are quite comfortable like going with this kind of ideology and saying, oh, it still makes sense, but you just change a few things and you change kind of the reach, bring everything down to this life or this world instead of having any sort of transcendent view, but following something similar. So if you want to kind of imagine what it would look like, I think things like Ethics for a New Millennium by His Holiness Dalai Lama, okay, which is like for people who don't care about views about reality really, but just kindness, will make us better, and kind of very general basic rules, that should be taught, for basic human being kind of ethics. Could be something like that, for example. Otherwise, you could look at the actual secularized Buddhist-inspired secularized lineages like Shambhala training, right? Where actually is quite interesting. Yeah, it's not at all like a purely similar to what Bachelor does. It's still very spiritual, and there's a lot of myths and stories and lions and tigers and all kinds of symbolism. Yeah, and I think that's especially interesting because we think a sort of secularized religion will not have any rituals or any doctrines. Actually, they end up, I think, like Bachelor Souls, there is a doctrine, which is metaphysical realism, right? So there's still, and a lot of those things still have rituals and things like that. So yeah, I don't know what it would look like, but we will see. But I have a sense that this is very still kind of immature sort of way of dealing with those things. That's why I think it's good to keep conversation going, not just barbecue, but kind of look at, okay, so that's fine. How can we kind of work, with that, and also not try to exclude, or reject, or say, oh, you have to believe in two truths and emptiness, otherwise you're not allowed in our monastery. And that's not a Buddhist attitude. Yeah, it's never been there. I think a very strong tendency for orthodoxy. So yeah, but otherwise, yeah, these are maybe interesting examples to look at. But I don't really know myself. I think without this, like for example, if you want to practice something that inspired by Mahayana Buddhist practice, but you're not interested in the view, I can't imagine me that after 10 years you just get bored and you drop it because it makes no sense. And also it doesn't work. And that we hear a lot. People who come and say, oh, I've been practicing meditation for 20 years, but I'm still saying, yeah, it doesn't work. Yeah. So I think people just kind of get bored and drop it because it doesn't go anywhere. So that may be a sense, but there may be some types of Buddhism that are more suitable. I don't know. I think Tenzi, that question.
I'm not too clear about Stephen Batchelor. So was it trying to reconstruct the Buddhism, or he wants to establish Buddhism without any influence of later commentaries or tradition, or does he want to bring up the pure Buddhism by his own, or without losing the essence? Or so I was not too clear about.
Yes, I think to many of the points you mentioned, yes. I would say in a nutshell, he wants to find a way to make sense of Buddhism in the current world and current culture. So that has kind of moved on from beliefs in metaphysics and sort of things that you have to believe simply out of faith rather than by applying a sort of skeptical attitude. Now he finds that the best way of doing that is to go to what he considers to be the original teachings of the Buddha, which are those teachings that are not interested about views of reality, but just applying a sort of pragmatic take on sort of problems of life and suffering. So in other words, yes, he does see himself as going back to the origins and sort of renewing sort of Dharma traditions and kind of bringing back authenticity by going back to the source. And I think also all Buddhist teachers do that, yeah? When Tsongkhapa comes in 15th century or 14th century and says, oh, I got the right view of Madhyamaka, which is really new. Actually, he says, this is the original view of the Buddha. They all say that. But by saying, okay, the way to make it authentic is to go back, but also that means make it compatible with our current culture. I think that's what he wants to do. So make a new way, yes, but he doesn't think, I think he's making up anything new, right? He's kind of going back to the source. Now, of course, historically, this is not very convincing. Especially now, I think historians tell us that the idea that the Pali canon have everything that is original and ancient, I think has been shown to be a sort of something that we need to forget about. Yeah, the oldest Buddhist texts we have are not in Pali. They're not from Theravada school. They're probably from Prajnaparamita sort of literature. And this whole model that everything that is ancient is the Pali canon and so forth, I think has been disproven by scholars like Peter Skilling, like very clearly. And so we don't have to accept that, but it fits, I think, his model. So I think that's what he's trying to do. Not so much found a new school, but keep the teachings alive by finding a way they can make sense for people of this world, which I think is own kind of generation, his own culture, something like that. Oh, yeah, I have time. I'm not sure what time we're supposed to end, but sure.
Yeah, maybe we'll do one or two more questions and that'll
Okay.
be it. Okay, so Nicholas, you've been having your hand up for a while. I'm sorry. You can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hello, Philippe. Greetings from Spain. Thank you very much for your wonderful talk. And I think you made some very good points. My question is, do you think Stephen Batchelor is aware that he's basing all this work on what you have called metaphysical realism? I have been thinking of Federico Campagna. I don't know if you've read his work. He's an Italian philosopher who writes in English, and he says that this metaphysical realism could be described as the collapsing of essence on existence. So we don't see that, we don't see it as a metaphysical doctrine. We just think it is the way things are. Do you think this is the case with Stephen Batchelor? Because he strikes me as a very intelligent person, and I just have always been wondering if he's aware of this. Thank you very much.
Thanks. That's an interesting question. Yeah, I think what you said, I mean, of course, it's just a guess, but that's my feeling of what it is. It thinks that metaphysical realism somehow does not qualify as a metaphysical view. It has a sort of special exception or special pass because it's based on not on metaphysical arguments, but just on the empirical view of the world. You know, we're just seeing it with our senses, but your senses don't tell you like that things, what is real or not. Yeah. So I think it's because, yeah, he just considers it to be a given. And so that's the kind of least metaphysical perspective you can have, is to stick with that. And probably I don't think he would call it that either. You would say, no, I'm just kind of staying away from any metaphysics. But I think looking at it from a Buddhist perspective, we have to say, you know, that's just another view. That's just another view. And you just haven't formulated it for yourself because you think you don't have to. Okay, so it's shared enough, I think, by enough people around you that nobody questions it. And so you just say, no, that's just reality. So I think that's how you described it. So yeah, I would agree with what you said. Thanks for that question. Yeah. But I didn't catch the name of that philosopher, but yeah, I'd be interested in looking at that.
Federico Campagna.
Campagna, okay.
Campagna, C-A-M-P-A-G-N-A. Thank you very much, Philippe.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and there's one more that's been written in the chat, so I was thinking I will read it out. Siri Seal writes, in terms of relieving suffering, what makes empiricism and the scientific materialist views persuasive is their efficacy. For example, if we look at Tibetan culture before the Cultural Revolution, despite a culture apparently based on the aspiration to relieve suffering, nevertheless, the culture was deeply problematic, with a huge infant mortality rate, feudalistic practices, brutal forms of law and order, and a medical model stuck in the early Middle Ages. Some argue persuasively that the more religious views are leavened by modern ideas of social justice, not supported by dogma, the more reasonable and effective they have become. And the opposite is also true. What is your answer to this?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yeah, especially these days. I think we have to there's a sort of Buddhist view on suffering as something unavoidable, yeah, as long as you're in samsara. So the most sort of important contribution you can make to humanity or to people's lives is to at least give them a sense that, yeah, there is an escape, and to keep a method, at least some method, to be able to find a way out of this samsara is the most precious thing you can do. And so, and that, for example, is instantiated in Tibetan culture in things like people saying, if you really want to help sentient beings, go in a cave and practice meditation. And once you get some spiritual realization, okay, maybe you can't cure, you know, their poverty or the fact that they're politically, you know, they're not free or something like that. But maybe they have a chance of actually getting out because they have this human rebirth. So there's a sense of neglect of, you know, relieving temporary suffering, of not putting that much emphasis on material progress, for example. And that can be a criticism of that tradition. But also, so you can say, though, yeah, these things are not necessarily incompatible. You know, as a society, you could have a place where people have great material progress and they're free from, you know, infant mortality, and they have access to modern medical techniques that can cure you if you have a fracture or surgery or anything like that. But there's really a question of priorities. And I think the kind of more, you could say, conservative or traditional Buddhist view is that this is very rare, just having the opportunity to, you know, maybe leave samsara. And if you don't, then it cannot come, you know, for a long, long time. So at least giving people that option, and also recognizing that material progress doesn't necessarily lead to more happiness. It doesn't solve all the problems. And there are a lot of people who don't, you know, are not necessarily in danger of physical trouble or poverty or something like that. And they still suffer a lot mentally. Or there are some people who have amazing material conditions, but they still see themselves as being poor, right? Because they don't have air conditioned in all the rooms, or I don't know, something like that, where even 50 years ago, that didn't even exist, you know, in most parts of the world. And so, yeah, you can look at it from this point of view. As for the social justice, yeah, that's a big question also, like karma and Buddhism and social justice. That is another, I think, area where modern culture and Buddhism have to have a good conversation. And I don't think it's really directly related to Stephen Batchelor, but there are a lot of good conversations to have there. But yeah, I think seeing suffering as something that happens because of adventitious, you know, circumstances in the world and that can be fixed, as opposed to seeing suffering as something that is unavoidable. And as soon as you have a chance to really get free of it, you just drop all other concerns and you focus on that. This is, I think, a very clear point of distinction between the Buddhist attitude and the rest of that. Now, it doesn't mean that Buddhists are not interested, for example, through socially engaged Buddhism, in relieving, you know, when possible or when it's urgent, you know, temporary suffering, but never by giving up, you know, the real goal, which is you're never going to get full relief until you get liberation. And you're not going to get many chances at that. So if you have a chance now, you focus on that. I think that's my general overview of that point. But thanks for that question.